I've talked to senior agents for years about this case. They see some pretty strong parallels, even though there are differences. You've got couples, cars, isolated rural locations, lovers lane situations, and there's a sense that someone is rolling up on these couples. They think when they're stopped, that is, they're parking, and someone approaches them who initially they think does not come across as threatening, because as near as they can tell, no one's making an exit in their car. In other words, trying to get away from an offender. So whoever is approaching these couples when they're pulled over approaches them in an initially non-threatening way. And then somehow they're assuming control or some level of control over the couples, which might involve, as you both know, the use of a handgun or, other ways of threatening them and assuming control. But the through line seems to be...
We have some interesting guests today. Bill Thomas and Kristen Dilley from the Mind Over Murder podcast. Bill and Kristen, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Ray and Fitz. We're so pleased to join you.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
I first met Ray, I met Ray 25 years ago, forget that. But I first met Bill and Kristen at a crime con. And then I think, Kristen, you came to the premiere in Washington, D.C. of the D.C. Sniper sort of audio presentation that Jim Clemente and those did. And we've been friends since then. And I've been on your podcast a few times by myself. Ray, I think you've been on, maybe you on your own. And then we've been on at least twice, Mind Over Matter. And now for the first time, you're on Cold Red. So thank you for making your appearance with us today.
One of the things for our listeners, maybe if they're not aware of your show, which I can't believe if they're not, by the way, but tell us a little bit about who you are and what your podcast is all about.
All right, Kristen, you want to go first? That way I'll think of a good answer.
Okay. So I'm forging new trails is what this is. Okay. Well, I'm Kristen Dilley, and I am the co-host of Mind Over Murder. I am a victims advocate, but sort of an accidental victims advocate. I didn't really intend to get into this, but my podcast partner, Bill Thomas, did ask me at one point, hey, do you think I should do a podcast? I said, sure. And he said, well, I'll only do it if you'll do it. And so that is how I ended up becoming a true crime podcaster. But I've always had an interest in true crime, thanks to John Douglas and Mark Olshaker, who I started reading way too young. And this has sort of accidentally become my life's work, it seems like.
And I'm Bill Thomas. And I got into this because my younger sister, Kathy Thomas, and her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski, are the first two victims in the so-called Colonial Parkway murders in Virginia. And I had gotten into podcasting as a guest. Gosh, that's got to be 6-7 years ago, when the whole true crime podcasting thing was taking off. And Kristen and I were already working together on the Colonial Parkway murders, both wearing our advocate hats. And as Kristen mentioned, a number of podcasters where I guested to talk about our case and what was going on with the Colonial Parkway murders said, you should do a podcast. And I thought it would be more interesting to have two people and have a woman and a man. Kristen's younger than I am. She grew up in Virginia, although her work and schooling took her away, and now she's back. But it provides kind of a nice balance with the two of us. Interestingly, although we have this longstanding commitment, we've been doing this for 4 years, over 300 episodes, we have this pretty fundamental commitment that we will disagree if we need to. But what's interesting is even though we come at this case and many of these discussions from different places, We actually agree most of the time,
Yeah.
and it's actually very rare for us to disagree on or off the air. So it's been a great partnership.
Yeah, it really has been. No complaints on this end. Not that I would dare to complain if I had any.
I'm sure you would.
Well, Ray and I can relate to one being older and one being prettier. So, of course, and our fans will
You're going to tell me
realize.
you're both, right? Older and prettier, is that what you're going to say?
I'm waiting
Hey.
for it.
Hey, the votes have been counted, Ray. But that's another story. But on a serious note, I mean, obviously you started your podcast, and I know a number of episodes about the Colonial Parkway murders, but you obviously discuss other aspects of true crime, and I've been on discussing various topics. I know Ray has. So, but I would like to delve into, for our audience who maybe is not as aware of the Colonial Parkway murders, and no one knows it better than you, Bill. You are a brother of a victim, and there have been some recent developments in this case. We talked about some of them on your podcast a few months ago. Would you mind, for our audience's sake, sort of summarizing the whole thing, and quite frankly, where you were when you first found out about your sister's demise?
Sure. Let me cover the basics, and then we can get into some of the new news, and there's some real interesting developments. So with the Colonial Parkway murders, what you have are 4 double homicides of couples. It's approximately one couple a year. It's technically 3 years. It's 1986 to 1989. And we have a lesbian couple. My sister, Kathy Thomas, and her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski, are killed on the Colonial Parkway, which is this beautiful 23-mile-long ribbon of federal parkland that connects these historic sites, Jamestown, Yorktown, and Colonial Williamsburg. And the parkway is kind of known as a place, because it's secluded and dark, it's a place where couples will often go to be romantic. That's probably what happened in my sister Kathy's example. So in October 1986, they were brutally murdered, and their bodies were left in my sister's Honda Civic. And then approximately a year later, off the Colonial Parkway now, a second couple, Robin Edwards and David Knobling, were found shot to death after going missing a few days before at a place called the Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area, which again is a spot that couples often go to. It's very, very quiet and secluded. Although, interestingly, it's right next to a major bridge that crosses over the James River. And then approximately 9 months or so later, now we're up to April 1988, a couple went missing while on a first date. And this is Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, who were both college students at Christopher Newport University in Newport News. They had attended a college party and were trying to get home for a 2 a.m. curfew and somehow never made it home. Keith's Toyota Celica was found on the Colonial Parkway about a mile and a half or so from where my sister's car had been found about a year and a half prior. So the car was found, and there's clothing inside the Toyota Celica, but no bodies, and no bodies have ever been found. So technically that's a missing persons case, although I think it's a pretty safe assumption, 36 years later now, that Keith Call and Cassandra Haley are not going to walk through the door tomorrow. And then finally, the last in the series of what we refer to as the Colonial Parkway murders, again, is off the parkway. This is on Interstate 64 over Labor Day weekend 1989. I'll call them a couple, but they're actually traveling companions. Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer disappeared on Interstate 64 driving to Virginia Beach, and they went missing, and their bodies were found about 6 weeks later in an advanced state of decomposition off Interstate 64 at a hunt club. And we're not 100% certain how they were killed, but based on analysis by the Smithsonian Institution, Institute, excuse me, they appear to have been stabbed. There were nick marks on her hand bones, what looked like a defensive maneuver. You know, you'd put your hands up to fend off someone with a knife. And so they go missing over Labor Day weekend, and their bodies are found in October 1989. And then those 4 double homicides are referred to as the Colonial Parkway murders. It's obviously a little confusing right from the get-go. 2 of the incidents happen on the Colonial Parkway, and then 2 of the incidents happen about a half an hour or so in either direction from the center point of the Colonial Parkway. And the case gets a little complicated right from the start as well from a law enforcement perspective. Those 2 incidents that happened on the Colonial Parkway are handled by the FBI. The 2 incidents that took place off the Colonial Parkway are handled by the Virginia State Police. And then just to make things a little more complicated, they're handled by different Virginia State Police offices. So there's always been some coordination issues. You know, they were later rectified, but in the beginning, I think law enforcement struggled with the fact that the murders individually seemed a bit different, and in these different locations, it was hard to figure out, are we talking about a serial killer here, or are we talking about independent events? So let me stop there.
Kristen, you want to fill in any missing pieces? Because you're certainly well versed in this particular investigation, too.
Clearly he's got the basics of it. There are a couple of cases that we have looked at over the last few years as we've been kind of reassessing, and excuse me for using the term reprofiling. We're not profilers, obviously, but kind of reassessing what we think we know about the case. And there are a couple of other cases that we have always referred to them as Parkway adjacent cases, meaning they might be a part of the Parkway series, but they have not been considered as such by any law enforcement agency that we're aware of, at least that they've told us about. And so there are 2 cases that we are hoping will be given a closer look now that we've had some recent breaks in this case, and that is the disappearance and murder of Brian Pettinger and Lori Ann Powell, and both of those actually both of those bookend the disappearances of Robin Edwards and David Knobling and Keith Call and Cassandra Haley. So I think that there are going to be other cases that law enforcement should be looking into and should consider folding into the Colonial Parkway murders mantle, if you will.
When you talk about these Colonial Parkway murders, and this is pretty much for our audience because we've talked about this before, but what did you see, or what did law enforcement see, or what do you believe is the linkage between the outlying cases and the cases that are within that close proximity on the Colonial Parkway?
Well, you know, I've talked to senior agents for years about this case. They see some pretty strong parallels, even though there are differences. You've got couples, cars, isolated rural locations, lovers lane situations, and there's a sense that someone is rolling up on these couples. They think when they're stopped, that is, they're parking, and someone approaches them who initially they think does not come across as threatening, because as near as they can tell, no one's making an exit in their car. In other words, you know, trying to get away from an offender. So whoever is approaching these couples when they're pulled over approaches them in an initially non-threatening way. And then somehow they're assuming control or some level of control over the couples, which might involve, as you both know, you know, the use of a handgun or, you know, other ways of threatening them and assuming control. But the through line seems to be the elements I just mentioned, as well as what they think is a post-mortem movement of vehicles and a staging of vehicles to create certain impressions. So whoever's involved in the Colonial Parkway murders seems to be killing the couples and then moving the vehicles around and staging them, moving clothing and other items. And they seem to have an intention, but it's not always 100% clear exactly what their intention is.
Yeah, staging is usually done for by individuals who can be connected to the crime. So the husband kills his wife when she's sleeping, and he makes it look like he pulls stuff out of the drawers, and he'll kick a window in, and you'll find out the window was pushed out instead of pushed in, and things like that. Other people may stage crime scenes for psychosexual purposes. I think what we have in the murders you just described, it would be somehow more akin to that. I haven't examined all the pictures of all the crime scenes, but from what you described, with 4 to 6 different couples here, the odds are this killer wasn't known to all of them, and probably none of them, quite frankly. So for any sort of staging that would have happened, it would either have been to facilitate his escape or non-identification, or there's some psychosexual aspect to it. And that's the primary reasons. You'll see sometimes, especially women's bodies will be found, posed in some ways. And I don't have to get too graphic, but their legs are up, things like that. And that's part of the staging process, but that's done for different reasons than someone wants to cover up one of them the person becoming a suspect. So interesting aspects to how these crime scenes were left by the offender, which means they also knew they had some time to either come back to the scene, or actually just spend extra time there afterwards to move cars around, clothing, whatever it was that was being done. So, this person was probably getting better as he was going along too. He knew how to control time. He knew when the police patrols may come by, if at all. And these are some benefits that no matter what you're doing in life, you do it enough times, you're going to get better at it.
And I would say both of these, I think, Kristen, you could probably say in almost all of these examples, the roadways were very lightly patrolled.
Yes, very, very much so. Very much so. The Colonial Parkway is, it is a really beautiful stretch of roadways. Bill mentioned it is 23 miles, and it connects several historic landmark areas. And there are plenty of natural fishing and beach areas along the way, but it is relatively lightly patrolled. The York County Sheriff's Office will do drive-bys through there, and the James City County and York County officers will use it to get from one end of the county to the other. But if you're looking especially at nighttime, you do not have a lot of people out on patrol. And so that does leave a wide, area in which people could hook up, do some low-level drug deals or whatever else. And you pretty much have a guarantee that, unless you're really unlucky at that particular time of day, no one is going to catch on to what you're doing. And I think that our offender used that to his advantage.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that's strange about the Colonial Parkway itself is it's very narrow.
Yeah.
They jokingly call it the nation's narrowest national park, because what they did is the federal government went out and bought and acquired land, sometimes from the federal government itself, because there's a number of military installations along there. And what they wanted to do was create this ribbon of land in an old-fashioned highway look. This is before the interstate highway system. So it's built in the 30s,
Yep.
primarily to look like an old-fashioned highway. So that means that there are no businesses on the parkway. It goes through woods, and it runs along the James and York rivers. No traffic lights, no stop signs, no nothing.
Very few street lights.
Right. So it's pitch black out there.
Yeah, it is.
And as Kristen says, it's kind of lonesome. So if you want to go there and be romantic or whatever, it's probably a good spot for that. My first takeaway when I went to the Colonial Parkway for the first time, and remember this is after my sister had been killed, was how it was almost like a shooting gallery, because in most examples, as you make your way along the 23 miles, there's a river on one side, and then you might not see it, but there's a chain link fence in the woods on the other side. So sometimes it's only a few hundred yards wide. What I'm getting at is, and I think Kristen was touching on this, for the offender or offenders, this is actually a perfect little hunting ground, because if you roll up on a couple, they can only get away by running or driving away, but you kind of can't go to the side because typically the water's there on one side and there's a fence there on the other side. So I don't think anybody was thinking about this when they designed the thing in the 30s and 40s, but it ended up kind of being oddly restrictive in terms of your ability to escape an attacker.
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept when you talk about an offender picking a territory that is already enclosed in a way as so that to trap his victims so that they can't ever have no way to escape.
Mm-hmm.
And then you talk about the staging aspect, which is usually done, as Jim said, in another one of these things, and he kind of evaded to this, is the fact they do it so that they can redirect the investigation away from themselves, because it's usually someone connected with the crime. So I find that interesting in of itself too, that there was some things done with the vehicles to maybe make it look like something that it wasn't. So those are all interesting concepts to this. But I have a question, and I want to throw this out to you, Bill and Kristen, since you're a victim's advocate. Many times when we look at crimes like this, the victims kind of get lost, and nobody talks about the victims.
Yeah.
And I've known, because Jim's been involved in hundreds of cases, I have too, that you get into this and everybody's concentrating on the offender. And until the FBI and the Behavioral Analysis Unit started talking about victimology, back in the 90s, in the early to mid 90s, nobody really paid attention to the victim. It was all about the crime scene. It was all about the offender and what evidence did we have. And no one thought about the victim. No one looked at the victim as a lens into what was going on. Did that bother you? I mean, Kristen and Bill, when you look at this, did that affect you guys?
I think it's so interesting that you brought that up, Ray, because I grew up in this area, and the Parkway case, by the time I was in high school, had taken on sort of an urban legend mythos. You don't go onto the Parkway because there's a serial killer hunting out there. It was very, very much a larger than life kind of tale. And you heard all sorts of, don't go on the Parkway, don't stop for cops, but you never heard the victims' names. It wasn't until I started doing research on this case to reach out to Bill, because I wanted to write a book on it, that I even learned anything about the victims at all. The people that I grew up with and went to high school with, all of the local people who had sort of heard of the Colonial Parkway murders, heard it more as almost an urban legend, as a mythic status almost. And so one of the things that I did almost immediately upon getting to know Bill was, I want to know about Kathy. Tell me about your sister. Tell me about all the other victims. I want to know everything about them, because they do get lost. You're exactly right. And, over the years, we have had, a number of different fictionalized takes on the case, most notably Patricia Cornwell's All That Remains, which is a fictionalized version of the Colonial Parkway murders. The idea, her theory of who the killer could be, really lent a lot to this, sort of mythos that was built around it. But she certainly didn't talk about the victims. she fictionalized them, and their names got lost there too. And the whole entire time, the offender was the main thing that everybody was concentrating on. Who is this offender? Is he a serial killer? Is he from Camp Perry, which is the CIA's main training base up here in Williamsburg? Is he military? Is he a cop? What is he? All we kept talking about for years and years as a result of, this sort of urban legend status practically was the offender, and the victims did get lost in it. So I agree with you 100%, Ray.
Cold Red fans, Fitz here. Are you interested in a career in criminal justice? You've heard me talk about numerous cases I've worked over the years involving the scientific analysis of language known as forensic linguistics. Well, Pennsylvania Western University now has a fully accredited MA program, which I actually co-developed, where I teach forensic linguistics along with various other excellent professors too. This is the only forensic linguistic graduate program in the world which is both online and asynchronous. That means the courses are 100% on your schedule. We have professor video recordings, academic readings, and real-life case exercises posted weekly, and you can access any time to review and then complete the week's assignment. If you're interested in learning how written and spoken language can help solve crimes and get a master's degree at the same time, check out the Pennsylvania Western University's Forensic Linguistics program at www.penwest.edu/justice.
Well, I think we've made an effort, you and I, to steer the conversation back in the direction of the victims. And one of the things we try to do with Mind Over Murder is, obviously, we don't just cover the Colonial Parkway murders, as Jim mentioned, but we do try to introduce the idea of victimology and what these young people were up to, and to make some observations about them as people. I mean, one of the things is we say couples all the time, and I'll correct myself, because the truth is only Kathy and Becky, the lesbian couple, interestingly, are the only serious couple in this series. Incident number 2, Robin Edwards and David Knobling had met that day and had gone to a movie and an arcade, but they didn't know each other well. Incident number 3, the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, they were on a first date, so you couldn't call them a serious couple either. And then the 4th incident, Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, she's actually dating his brother, and they are traveling together because Daniel's going to be moving in with them down in Virginia Beach to help make ends meet, but they're not a couple either. So what's interesting is we say couples a lot, and then when you throw Lover's Lane murders into the mix, and we did a television series for the Oxygen Network a few years ago, that they actually ended up changing the name of the show from the Colonial Parkway murders to, they called it the Lover's Lane murders. So, but the truth is, in terms of lovers, really the only 2 lovers in any serious way are Kathy and Becky, the first victims. So there's a lot of things about what was going on with these 4 sets of young people that Kristen and I have tried to articulate more in the last few years. And we've tried to encourage other family members to come on our podcast and talk about the case. But part of that's to, as you said, Ray, to kind of fill out the personalities and not just talk about an offender. And of course, until very recently, we never had a specific offender to focus on. There were 150 persons of interest, all these different suspects coming and going. Some of them may be viable to this day, but it's only since January 2024 that we've had a specific offender to focus on. But I think we've tried to fill out the lives of these victims so that they aren't just unknown names to this, guy that comes out of the woods.
And Bill, we asked you to summarize this murder, these murders, and within 90 seconds, we had all the names of the victims. And obviously, you have them memorized, and you've lived with this one as your sister, of course, and her friend. And so that says a lot about the mentality that you and Kristen have regarding these type of cases. And it does reflect, when Ray and I put this podcast together, we said, this is going to be about victims. We're going to bring as many on as we can, be it stalking victims or people who were abused. Some even killed their abusers, went to prison and came out, and we've interviewed them. So we had police detectives who've been shot by bank robbers. So we like to bring those types of people in too, and to actually present to our audience, but also certainly reference them by name. And we stay away from names completely of bad guys. We'll get into perhaps a little bit more here, but of the bad guy you just mentioned, potential bad guy, we'll call him, who came in as a suspect. But you mentioned kind of the sliver of land that this national park is. Mm-hmm. And just to make it clear, the FBI doesn't investigate everyday homicides. They only investigate homicides of judges, federal agents, federal employees, and murders that happen at national parks or federal land. And that is why two of these sets of murders, as you described, are being investigated by the FBI, and other ones weren't. I know finally a task force was put together with state police, et cetera, and FBI. But it leads me to, you look at someone like a Ted Bundy. He had the personality, and he was a decent-looking guy and a charmer. When he could target his victims anywhere, and he would get them essentially to come with him, or he would, talk his way into getting into their car. But someone like the Colonial Park murders, they were more of a geographic opportunity targeter, if you will. And it was just this stretch of land, and they could be couples, they can be straight, they can be not, lesbians, whatever. It didn't matter. It happened to be within the geographic time and space that worked exactly for this person. And as you said, no one was connected to the other murder victims, and they were almost loosely connected within each car itself. And that tells you, again, something else about putting a profile together on this person. He was an opportunist, and really the car and the location and the time of day, more specifically night, would be what leads to him approaching the car. And as we kind of tend to think, he used some kind of subterfuge. Hey, knocking on a window. Did you see my dog? My little kid is supposed to be here. And that's the subterfuge that's used, gets control somehow, gets them to lower their defenses, and gun, knife, punch in the mouth, whatever it is how eventually he took over. So as we know, serial killers, serial offenders have different ways of approaching their victims. And this guy may have relied more on the geography of this whole parkway more than the individual cars or the people themselves. The classic example of wrong place, wrong time on their parts. And unfortunately, they paid for their lives with that.
I kind of agree with Jim, and it kind of takes me back to something that you said, Bill, that this individual, he had a geographic location, and it could have been an hour, but it appears that he was constantly on the hunt for his victims. And those victims, it wasn't as though he was surveilling these victims. He had them picked out prior. These were victims of opportunity. They happened, as Jim said, be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this individual, he was a hunter, and he hunted his victims. And that's the type of person he was. The thing that I'd like to know more about is he didn't stop. Something caused him to stop, or whether he was arrested, he was in the military and transferred out. Who knows? You know what I mean? But there was something. And just let me ask, and I know our listeners want to know, the period of time over when these homicides occurred. We have 1987 to 1989?
86 to 89.
86 to 89. So we have a 3-year period. Most of the time, when you look at military, and that's a heavily area for military, most of the time can be anywhere from a 2-year enlistment period, another 2 years up, a year to get familiar with the area, and then you move on. I mean, that's all possible. That's all possible. But you look at why did this stop, and is there anything anywhere else in the country that matches this MO?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So that's what I would if I'm still working and I'm looking at this, I'm looking at our VICAP system and I'm saying, is there anything anywhere else that kind of ties it? And so for our audience, VICAP is the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And what happens in this program is any unsolved homicide, missing person, or rape is submitted to an FBI database by the local police department and is compared with every other crime across the country, actually internationally. And they look at all these different crimes to find a link, if there's any linkage that would link one crime to the other. So I'm sure they've done that, or I would hope they've done that, Bill.
No, they definitely have. I remember in 1990, they were looking at a brutal murder of a couple in Houston, and there were a lot of similarities between that double homicide and the Colonial Parkway murders. So I remember the FBI went out and took a look at, and I remember them saying to me, couples homicides are very rare. Lovers Lane's homicides are very rare. And one of the senior agents said to me, Bill, what are the chances that we would have 4 double homicides under similar circumstances in a fairly tight geographic area over a 3-year period? And they said, we think that's beyond the realm of chance. Now, they did look at these other homicides looking for linkage and didn't find any that I'm aware of, but that was something they were absolutely looking at.
Yeah, in our world, coincidences don't happen very often, especially over spatially speaking or temporally speaking, geography or time. And are there outliers? You know, of course. Could there be copycats? Of course. But from everything I'm aware of with this case, there are pretty clear indications, certainly 4 of them being connected. And I don't disagree. There may be another 2, if not more, that also could be. And that's always the toughest part for law enforcement. And we as profilers, we call it linkage analysis. And that is taking all the factors, all the evidence, and of various crime scenes, including victimology, what we talked about earlier, and trying to link these particular crimes and see if they are the same offender. You're not even looking for a name and an address early on in these types of analyses. You're just looking, are they in fact linked in some obviously evidentiary way, DNA, fingerprints, that's the best. But if that doesn't come together, is it time of day? Is it geography? And if that doesn't come together, is it behavior? Is there something very distinctive that the offender undertook with his victims? And we certainly have some of that here. A lot of the post-offense behavior, quite frankly, from what I understand from these crime scenes, again, with clothing, cars, and things like that. So, so that does make it difficult. And people do, of course, travel across the country. But at least for 3 to 3.5 years, we had somebody very focused on the Colonial Parkway and plying their trade. And I think we mentioned on your show, this guy, I would call him an apex predator. And he, in fact, knew what he was doing. Mm-hmm. He may not, his same skill set may not work in lower Manhattan or Brooklyn or the south side of Chicago, but in this particular region, this was his comfort zone. He knew how to get around. He knew ingress. He knew egress for himself. He knew there was limited ingress or egress for his victims. And that gave him all the power and control that he needed for at least 4 times and perhaps more. So and every crime scene tells us more about an offender, and it can really help build that profile and put it together. But up until about 4 or 5 months ago, if even that, a bunch of victims, but a bunch of offenders, but were brought up, but nothing really hit home until several months ago. And do you want to share with us and our audience what happened then?
Yep. January 8th. I don't think that's a date that either of us are going to forget anytime soon, is it, Bill?
No, probably not.
So on January 8th, the FBI and the Virginia State Police held a joint press conference announcing that they had linked Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., who was a fisherman and a waterman who had been deceased since 2017, to the deaths of Robin Edwards, David Knobling, and a third victim that Bill and I were unfamiliar with, a woman named Teresa Howell. And this was a particularly interesting press conference in that there was a lot of information given, but there was also a lot of information that was withheld. And I'm going to let Bill go into the specifics on that in particular, because that is particularly infuriating for him on that day. But yeah, that was the first time that there had been a name definitively linked with the DNA linkage to back that up. So he was linked via DNA to Robin Edwards, David Knobling, and Teresa Howell.
So about a year ago, we got a tip. We, the Colonial Parkway Murders families, got a tip, and Kristen and I had heard about this, that the Virginia State Police and the Virginia Department of Forensic Science had applied for and received a SAKI grant, a Sexual Assault Kit Initiative grant, to test remaining evidence from the Robin Edwards, David Knobling murder, specifically from Robin Edwards' rape kit. Now, this rape occurred in 1987, and both Robin and David's bodies were dumped in the water, and they were in salt water for a period of 3 days. So we now have a very challenging scenario with the remaining evidence, in that this is a badly degraded 30-plus-year-old DNA sample. There's a very small amount of it left because, as you know, when you test evidence, sometimes the evidence is consumed, particularly in the earlier years of the Colonial Parkway murders. And because the evidence had been contaminated with seawater, it was not in ideal shape. But when we received the tip that this was happening, we reached out to the Virginia State Police. And by we, I mean myself and Jeanette Edwards Santiago. She would be the older sister of Robin Edwards, the victim. And one of the things that Jeanette and I talked about was, we understood that there was a very small amount of DNA left, but our attitude was, look, time's a wasting here. It's been over 30 years. This evidence isn't getting any fresher. And half the parents, actually 9 of the 16 parents of the victims in the Colonial Parkway murders, had gone to their graves looking for answers in this case. So our attitude was, even if this SAKI grant testing uses the last bit of evidence remaining in this case, let's take the shot. So the investigator, who's a sharp young guy, agreed with us. He did tell us privately that there was some internal debate at the Virginia State Police and at the Department of Forensic Science about this very issue. Like, do we take our shot now? And the feeling was that the science had gotten so much better and more precise that they felt that it was worth the try. So interestingly, the first lab that they sent the evidence to was unsuccessful in extracting a working profile. And it was then sent to a second independent lab. And this second private lab, I think we know who it is, but I won't say the name because I'm not 100% sure, did have some success. And so they were able to create a workable profile from this badly degraded, very small sample. So, finally we're catching a break here. And then as part of that effort, other area law enforcement agencies, including the Hampton, Virginia Police Department, were comparing this new profile that had been created from Robin Edwards' rape kit. And they got a hit there too, and that's how Teresa Howell's name came up. And she had been murdered in 1989 after likely meeting her assailant who raped and murdered her at an after-hours club called the Club Zodiac. And so now we have a situation where Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., who, by the way, Ray, to your point from a moment ago, this guy's also an avid hunter. And I remember years ago, the FBI agents working Kathy's case had said to me, we think that this offender went out and engaged in hunting activities. In other words, hunting couples. But this guy actually is an avid hunter, fisherman, and what they call a waterman in Virginia, which is someone who makes their living on the water. So Wilmer's name is now identified as being associated with one of the double homicides in the Colonial Parkway murders, Robin Edwards and David Knobling, and Teresa Howell, this other single woman who was attacked, raped, and murdered in 1989.
Wow.
Okay.
That's a mouthful.
Isn't it?
It really is. I mean, when you sit back and you look, I guess the question to both of you, because you, especially you, Bill, because since this has happened, and it happened in your family, you know, you haven't probably had a great night's sleep because you're wondering.
I almost made that joke a second ago when Kristen mentioned the date, and I almost said, and I haven't had a good night's sleep since.
Neither of us have.
You know, I got to ask, do you believe strongly that what they've uncovered, and I know the DNA says this, but it doesn't tie it back to your sister and her friend? So Not yet, anyway. There is a tie-in, though, and this is one of the things I was so frustrated with the FBI about. At the press conference, the question was asked, can you say when Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. first moved on to your radar? And the person that was acting as the spokesperson was actually from the Virginia State Police, and I respect her immensely. I've seen her speak any number of times, and she said no. She literally said no. They would not answer that question. And then later on in the same press conference, the question was asked a second time, a different way. You know, will you say how Wilmer moved onto your radar? And they refused to say. Now, what was very frustrating, and I won't pretend to hide my frustration, we knew how Wilmer had moved onto their radar because, and this is the part that infuriated me, and this has happened a lot in the last 4 months. The FBI refused to admit that Wilmer was suspect number one in the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley. Now, I was told a story in 1988 by my father, who has since passed away, that he learned from the FBI agents working this case that they had questioned a waterman in the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley because his very distinctive vehicle, this pickup truck with vanity plates, no less, was seen on the Colonial Parkway numerous times, especially the night that Keith Call and Cassandra Haley went missing. And then, of course, Keith's car is found on the Colonial Parkway. And so he was questioned by the FBI and given at least one and possibly two polygraph examinations. And he was regarded as suspect number one. And they actually had the right guy, but they made a decision to let him go. And very unfortunately, and we understand that the case agents who were working the case felt very strongly that they had the right guy in Wilmer. And unfortunately,
I don't know how this all works, but decisions were made to let Wilmer go. And the truth is, those case agents were right. They did have the right guy. And I believe very strongly Wilmer is directly responsible for the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, which is likely a homicide. And now he's been linked to Robin Edwards and David Knobling, and then, of course, to Teresa Howell. So it was very frustrating to have the FBI deflect the fact that Wilmer was so closely linked to another one of these double homicides.
You know, I'm going to throw this out, though, because I've been on that end where you know in your gut that what you have and who did this, you know in your gut. And when you take that and you move it forward up the chain of command to your brass, but more importantly, when you take it over from a prosecutorial standpoint, you take it over to U.S. Attorney's Office, they are the ones that make the decision. They say, nope, we're not moving forward with this. You don't have enough. And, you know, they say, okay, we're going to continue to go back. I'm going to continue to do this. And the case, which is already cold, continues to get colder and colder the further you get away from it. I want to thank you guys for your podcast, because we're doing what you're trying to do. And we're trying to bring light onto the victims and how important the victims are, not just in solving crimes, but you can't ever forget about the victim. They're really, really important. And, you know, we need to spend more focus on them and not the offender.
Agreed wholeheartedly.
Yeah. Hear, hear.
Kristen, give us any websites or how to find Mind Over Murder, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. So we have a number of social media pages. Mind Over Murder has a Facebook page.
Really?
No, we may ask you to repeat that.
Mind Over Murder over any killer.
Yeah, Kristen, we lost you there for a minute.
We can edit, so can you say that again?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sure. We have social media pages on Facebook. You can also find us on Apple podcast platforms and any other podcasting platform that's available to you.
Ray and I have been guests on Mind Over Murder. Check out some of the old episodes. These guys know what they're talking about, not just the Colonial Parkway murders, of course, but other cases and even topical ones as well. So I'm going to sign this out. Please, everyone, consider subscribing to the Cold Red Podcast and follow us on all Cold Red Podcast social media platforms. And we can be found at coldredpodcast.com. I'd like to thank our two producers, Matt Robinson and Matt McLaughlin, and also our music composer, Rick Schilling. So until next time, we'll see you right here. You know where to find us. Everyone, have a great night. Ray, thanks. Bill, thanks. Kristen, thanks. And stay safe out there, everyone.